Well, hello and welcome to the 2020 Royal Society and Insight Investment Book Prize. I want to begin by thanking in particular our sponsors, Insight Investment. It's obviously, usually at this time, we'd be celebrating at the Royal Society in Carlton House Terrace in London with a big party and lots of people here. Clearly, we have to do the event online this year. And so I really do want to thank Insight Investment for supporting the prize in these very difficult times for everybody. And also I'd like to thank Waterstones for hosting this event. And I should also say that all the books that you hear discussed by the authors in this event, all 6 books that have been shortlisted for the prize, will be available at Waterstones with a discount of £2.50, which Waterstones have generously offered. So if you'd like to buy one of these books, well, all of them, I hope, and you're interested, then go down to Waterstones or go online at Waterstones and buy them with that discount. So thank you, Waterstones. The judges praised all 6 authors that have been nominated and shortlisted for the prize on the rigorous scientific content of their books. That is the primary aim of the prize. That's why the Royal Society supports the prize. But also the judges commended the authors for conveying those scientific ideas through engaging storytelling. And the panel reflected that each book shows a unique perspective on a well-known subject, but also uncovers little-known truths about everyday interactions in a way that's accessible to readers. That's a key point, again, I think, for the Royal Society. Clearly, we live in times where science is forefront, up front and centre, particularly with the pandemic. But we argue every year that science is central in general. And so science communication is taken particularly seriously at the Royal Society. Indeed, my position at the Royal Society is Professor of Public Engagement in Science for that reason. So to the books, 4 of the books on the shortlist explore what the judges call the layered intricacies of what it means to be human. These books present a unique perspective and facts on the human body, providing illuminating insights on the history of psychiatry, human evolution, and navigating social norms. And then 2 of the books help us better understand our world and some of the issues we deal with at a deeper scientific level. So without further ado, let me introduce the first panel. The way we're going to organise this evening is we're going to have 2 panels, 3 authors each. We'll have a question and answer session, a discussion with those 3 authors. The first panel will last for about 40 minutes. And then at 7:45, we'll have a short break and then come back with the second panel. So now for the first panel. The first of our 3 authors. So please welcome and let me invite onto this Zoom session, Bill Bryson, Susanna Cahalan, and Dr. Camilla Peng. So hello, everybody. I think you've all got to unmute. There we go.
Hello, have you got me now, Brian?
Well, you're all loud and clear. So, so first, I think we'll start by going around the panel. We'll go in alphabetical order, and which means that we start with Bill. And I'm going to ask you just in a minute or so to summarise the content of your book.
Gosh, okay. Well, the book is called "The Body: A Guide for Occupants," and the idea of it is that I've been struck for a long time by the idea that we spend our whole lives occupying this space, this bag of tissue, and yet we're very limited in what we know about it. If you walk around me, you will see more of me in 10 seconds than I've seen of myself in my entire life, because I've never seen the back of my head other than in a mirror or photographically. I've never seen inside my own ears. There's whole parts of our bodies that we're completely unacquainted with, even though we've been living with them the whole of our lives. And then when you start thinking about what goes on inside you, I think most of us are kind of embarrassed about the fact that we know as little as we do. So, like most people, I had this understanding that there are all these wonderful organs and systems operating inside me that keep me together, that allow me to enjoy the supremely agreeable condition known as life, without really understanding how they work and interact. So the whole idea was just really to try to understand this magnificent contraption that is us.
Thanks, Bill. Magnificent contraption. I like that description of each of us. Susanna.
Well, I always struggle with really summarizing my book because it was written to be kind of a mystery. So I always worry about giving too much away, but I will do my best. So The Great Pretender is a way of kind of a deep dive into a history of psychiatry through the lens of one of its most influential study called On Being Sane in Insane Places. That study revolved around Stanford professor David Rosenhan and 7 other participants going undercover in psychiatric hospitals across America and testing the nature of diagnosis and the quality of its institutions, and finding both lacking to great degree. The study itself was a kind of black eye for psychiatry. One psychiatrist at the time said it was like a sword plunged into the heart of psychiatry. I became very interested in this study because of my own misdiagnosis, and I started a 6-year odyssey that became an investigation as I started to realize that things were not as they seemed. So.
Thank you, Susanna. And Camilla.
Hello. Yes, so my book is called Explaining Humans, and that's because humans are pretty much alien to me. And that's because I have autism spectrum disorder and ADHD and anxiety disorder. And I think a lot of the time people can find these hard to relate to, much like they can find it hard to relate to science. But to me, to feel human and a part of this sociological tapestry, I've had to find my way through, and that's using science, because how do you make sense of the world when you're not wired to connect? What does that even mean? Does that mean that I don't have a duty to be? And what I do in my book is try and navigate the different lenses of science, maths, psychology, even machine learning, and all the favorite parts of biochemistry that I love, to make humans approachable to me, but in turn, science approachable to a lot of people, because everyone says to me, oh, you're a scientist. Okay. And then they kind of move on, which, I mean, wouldn't you if you didn't understand something or if you thought it was scary? So what I'm trying to do is democratize science to the point in which it's felt like it's human to them.
Thanks, Camilla. So we'll start, let's go back to Bill. You described the human body as a magnificent contraption. And I know your book is just full of descriptions of the body. And I think maybe a good way to start is you said it's a learning experience for you. You got interested. I find it remarkable, by the way, that there's a difference between an author and everybody else, that most people get interested, you decide to write an entire book on it. So can you give us three of the most fascinating things you discovered, perhaps, during the writing of the book?
3 of the most fascinating things I discovered. Oh, gosh, that's big. I wasn't expecting that one. But I mean, the single most amazing fact, I think, that I came across in putting the book together was the idea that we have 2 meters of DNA in every cell in our bodies, every nucleated cell in our bodies, and so many cells in your bodies that if you took all the DNA inside you and formed it into a single fine strand, it would stretch all the way to, it would stretch 10 billion miles to beyond Pluto. So there's enough of each one of us to leave the solar system. And to me, that's just a staggering thought. And it's just, I mean, it's illustrative of just how complex the human body is. So I think really the overall idea that most entranced me with doing the book was this notion that all of these incredibly complex systems operate in concert. 37 trillion cells within you are operating in a coordinated fashion to keep you, to make you. That's just, to me, that's a miracle.
And given the complexity that you mentioned, I go back to the first remark that I made about, was it daunting to decide to take this project on? Because obviously, I mean, I know, as a physicist, when I just pick up any book on biology or medical science, it's difficult. It's the most difficult. I mean, we are the most complex things we know of anywhere in the universe. So how do you decide that you would write a book on it?
Every time I start a book like this, Brad, get a couple of months in, I think I'm a complete idiot. Why have I taken this on? Because of course I'm starting from a position of really, quite profound ignorance, and eventually, it always occurs to me that actually you can make something of a virtue of that. The one advantage I have is that I do have this infinite capacity to be amazed by what I'm learning. There is a certain value in being, completely a blank slate when you start out. And what I've often found in interviewing scientists is how jaded they've become by their subject areas. That they when I just ask them, what was it that got you excited about lichens or whatever the specific area they're interested in, they often have to stop and think. They have to go back and reflect about what it was that drew them to a certain area of science, because it's become so routine, so pedestrian for them.
And I just have to ask you, because you did announce that this may be the last book that you write, at least for some time, which caused an outcry, I think, on social media. People were very upset about that. So is that how you feel? And was that a response to taking on this vast project? Have you decided that really is the last project?
I had decided before I took this on that I really would kind of like to wind down and retire. And one of the things that doing a book on the body does really reinforce is the knowledge that you only have one life, and that it is finite. And I think when you get to a certain age, you begin to realize that you haven't got all that many years left, and it's you start to reflect on how would you like to spend the time that's left to you. And I just don't want to spend it working. I've worked really hard for a long time, and now I'd like to just as I said in the interview I did recently, I'd like to still be able to get down on the floor with my grandchildren while I can still get back up again.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good as read as any, isn't it? I think. Susanna, if I can pick up something you said, you referred to your experience in the psychiatric system. So I know you wrote a book on this, Brain on Fire, before, but for those watching who aren't aware of that book, could you just describe what you meant by that and what your experience was?
Sure. I'm actually still kind of digesting the news, Bill, that this might be the last book. Good to say. I understand the perspective. But these books take a lot, and I'm sure trying to tackle the body in a book took a long time to do, and it took me about 6 years to do this book too. So I know it's like, it is, when you get into a new project, you can see, okay, this is how many years are going to pass. These are how many milestones in my life I'm going to go through by writing this book. But in terms of what you asked me, in terms of what predates The Great Pretender and very much kind of inspired The Great Pretender, was my own experience with misdiagnosis, which was chronicled in my first book, Brain on Fire. In that experience, which, at this point I'm over 10 years out of that experience, and it always feels like a very other person. And when I describe it, I always have this very disengaged way of talking about it, especially because it was also made into a kind of not so great movie. So it's like these all layers of myself, the book, the movie, and these kind of memories that remain. But in short, I for a brief period of time experienced psychosis and hallucinations, and got very, very sick, where I was hospitalized for a month and received varied misdiagnoses, including schizoaffective disorder and bipolar disorder, until I was ultimately properly diagnosed with what's called autoimmune encephalitis. And it is, I became the 217th person, the first person in the hospital system at NYU Medical Center in New York who was diagnosed with this new illness. And, but prior, when I had this misdiagnosis of a psychiatric condition, my care was very different than the care I treated when I became this kind of miracle neurological case. And this question of, the physical versus mental illness really intrigued me. And I was overwhelmed by the response to Brain on Fire, and how many people felt similarly caught up in this dichotomy, either the wrong side of that, or they were searching for a different diagnosis, or they felt marginalized or ignored. So, these questions of labeling and how we seem to value certain types of illnesses over others really intrigued me, and kind of sent me off on a rabbit hole that kind of sent me to the Rosenhan study.
And your book, again, as you said in the introduction, you mentioned the Rosenham study, it's critical of psychiatry. And at the moment, I think it's particularly resonant, that criticism of a part of the medical system, because we are, of course, in a pandemic. And that will, I think, lead to mental health problems for many people. So do you think it's very important now, perhaps more than ever, to shine a critical light on psychiatry?
Absolutely. I think to move forward, to progress, we have to question. We have to be critical. We can't be kind of blindly put our blind faith into medicine in general and psychiatry specifically. And I think in asking these questions, hopefully it will lead us towards asking the kind of right questions. The study itself raised some very important points about the limitations of psychiatry in general and the limitations of diagnosis and treatment. But it also derailed that discussion by bringing in oversimplified, in some ways, lack of nuance in these discussions. And I think you're completely correct. I think we're heading straight forward into a mental health crisis. And I think the past has showed us that we are very ill-equipped to deal with it.
And in the book, you focus in on this, the problem, as you see it, between the understanding the link between brain, mind, I suppose, and body. And essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially your conclusion is that we don't really understand that, or we have a poor understanding of that. So are you, first of all, is that a good characterization of your position? And secondly, do you see any progress? Do you think that it's, as Bill alluded to, really, in terms of understanding the human body, do you think that's too complex a question for the near or even medium term?
Yes, I think there's a few answers to that question. I think it does go back to what Bill said about the virtue of ignorance. I think we know very little about the interplay between mind, body, soul, these concept of brain. I mean, all of these very mutable parts of the self, of the body, self identity, we're learning more and more every day about how interconnected these areas are. And I hope that the hope is that 50 years from now, we'll look back on today and think this is primitive, and that's the goal here. I think that's the goal of scientific progress, is to be able to move to a place where we look at the past and think, look how far we've come. But what's been interesting about looking at that history, at the history of psychiatry specifically, but medicine in general, is that progress is not linear, that we don't always look back and think, okay, look how far we've come. And so that to me was a bit of an education there. But I do think that I am very optimistic about the future. I can't help it. And I think I'm very much embody cutting edge neuroscience and the idea of intervention and ingenuity in cure. I mean, I was effectively cured of a very serious psychiatric illness. And so that raises some real exciting questions about the future. But we do also have to acknowledge the limitations of the present moment too.
Yeah, I just wondered, Bill, I saw you listening to that intently, how you saw the state of our knowledge, the balance between great mysteries, particularly this interaction between mind and brain and body, and the vast amount that we do know about the human body.
Yeah, well, that is the extraordinary thing about the brain, is how little we know, and the body generally, really, how little we know about how it works in so many ways. I think the most amazing fact to me about the brain was that how efficient it is. I don't know if I'm going off on a tangent here, but everybody knows that it's the most magnificent computer in the universe. I mean, it is this amazing machine within us. And yet what I didn't realize was that it only needs 400 calories of energy a day in order to operate, which is about the amount of energy you would get from a blueberry muffin. So, as I say in the book, you try running your laptop for 24 hours on a blueberry muffin and see how far you get. And that to me is just an extraordinary thing. It's just how much the human body can do with really quite little input.
And so, Camilla, Susanna outlined there, and Bill as well, the complexity of the brain. Your book primarily, well, you begin by talking about your own neurodiversity, the term that you use, and you say that there are a cocktail of things, is the word you use, which is a beautiful or descriptive term to describe your neurodiversity. So could you expand on that and what you mean by that sentence and that description?
Yeah, so basically, I think what I mean by that is to highlight the fact that, much like when you say these mental health disorders, I like to call them mental health variances, because I feel like the disorder element is due to the intolerances of the environment and to the environment and from the environment. So I feel like when it comes to neurodiversity, by feature of evolution, we're all diverse, but when it comes to neurodiversity, you formerly known as you have a diagnosis of like autism or ADHD or like a psychosis disorder. And I feel this is quite interesting because a lot of people feel like, oh no, I've got they feel like the person has less of a duty to be or less valid in their opinion, and there's lots of different stigmas around that. But I'm like, hang on a minute, this is incredible. What a better way to highlight the ability of the human mind than the extremes. To me, neurodiversity is something that should be embraced because it's at the edges of human evolution. The cognitions that test the boundaries, that question the norms. And what I try and do in my book is explain how the different cocktail of neurodiversities, in my specific case, it's autism, which is manifests very differently in different people. And I think that's very important to highlight, which is probably why it's one of the most hardest things to diagnose. I also have anxiety disorder, which means that I live a month's worth of data, sensory data, anxiety data in the space of a day, than it would be in a month. So that means I'm exhausted, but that means I can obsess over things and come to conclusions, that point of convergence. And I feel there's a lot that can be said for that, because even though I might be crying in the corner, being silent when I shouldn't be, it means I come to solutions and I'm sure of them. So when it comes to a cocktail universities, I feel like it's important to know that they are on a spectrum, they are linked, but also it's important to know your shape of your neurodiversity, because that's when you can own it, can accept it, and can make room for you to live.
And you described your neurodiversity as a superpower. Again, a vivid description. In this sense, I mean, you've partly answered it, but what did you mean by that description?
Basically, superpower. So I did that just to highlight the fact that people with neurodivergences, can't speak now, have the right to be. And that doesn't mean that because we can, dance or trivialize the way in which we manifest our superpowers for neurotypicals. Everyone has a right to be. Whether you can write, whether you can draw, whether you can play music. And what I try to highlight in my neurodiversity is my autism, is that the main superpower is the ability to act normal, to make my autism easier for people to interact with me. Because at the moment, I'm probably holding in about 5 panic attacks normally. Not because I'm on here, just because, it's Monday. But when it comes to, but when it comes to it being an obsession, the ability to have that childlike obsession and survival instinct is such a powerful force, because not only does it get things done, it adds that directionality in which you can pursue the things that you're passionate about, the things that you care about. And that's one of the purest forces of humankind, is the ability to approach something with no preconceptions, because I don't assume anything. I have nothing, and that's what I describe in my book about being able to get to know someone, is that a lot of people have preconceptions and expectations, but I don't know what they mean. You start from a blank slate each time, and as much as that can be a hindrance, it's also a superpower, because you see everyone with fresh eyes.
Yeah, and you're just for those listening who don't know your background, so you're a PhD in biochemistry. And I noticed you're now researching, you're at UCL in London, researching translational bioinformatics. So I just wonder whether you could just give a quick, is it possible to give a 1 minute summary or a couple of minutes of your research now. And then perhaps just the question afterwards is why you chose to write such a personal book, because many people, it's very easy to write about the specifics of your research, but you chose to write a much broader book than that. So first of all, what is your research? The question. And secondly, why you chose to write this very broad and personal book.
Okay, I'll try and remember those two. The first one, so basically, yeah, so I work at a pharmaceutical company looking at translational bioinformatics as my main current science job. That's really interesting because we're looking at the cellular structure of the immune system, but on the computer. So we've got all this data from the lab, and we get to model it, and we get to be able to see how it changes. You know, for example, looking at gene markers on the transcriptomic level, which means the RNA level, and how it changes in different disease states. And we get to use really cool stuff like UMAP. That's quite a niche thing, I get that, but if you're into like bioinformatics, and UMAP is currently something that I'm using. In terms of so I actually volunteer at UCL in my free time, which is evenings and weekends, because I actually did my PhD there in looking at cancer evolution and what that means in terms of the protein structure, because that's the level in which we can design drugs to, I guess, inhibit cancer evolution. And at the moment, I've actually set up a collaboration between UCL and Francis Crick within my PhD, because I was like, we've got a genomics lab with great evolutionary data, and we've got a protein lab which is really good at looking at protein structure and function. And I was like, this is a marriage made in heaven, and this has got to happen. And when the project got started, my supervisor's like, you need to write your thesis. And I was like, I don't want to do that when this is going on. So now I feel like as a duty as completion, I do it in my spare time because I love it. And at the moment we've got a paper in prep that we're looking at, which will, fingers crossed, come out soon, but it should be a really good one. I'm really excited.
Yeah, well, so thank you. Susanna, so I asked Camilla that question about how she chose the subject she wrote about. But again, you've really outlined it, a very personal book following on from a previously personal book, Susanna. I wondered, so that's probably the answer to the question, how did you choose the subject? Perhaps I could ask you where you go now. You've got this, you know, you're a best-selling author. You've got this huge book, The Brain on Fire. Are you going to diversify outwards in terms of science journalism? Are you going to write something else? What's the next step?
Well, my goal is to find something that makes me as excited as Dr. Pang is about talking about the work that you do, because that is, I think, what, you know, as a writer who has to sustain this over, you know, the interest over several years, typically, you want that curiosity, you want that excitement, you want to feel drawn to something. And right now I do have a little bit of a kind of bite there in terms of interest. And my interest has headed towards psychedelics as a subject, because I really feel that that's a part of the culture in a new and exciting way. And so my interest has gone there, and talking about this kind of second wave psychedelic revival and going back to its origins. So that's kind of what I'm dancing around right now. I haven't quite figured out where I'm settling in terms of kind of focus, but I had that kind of that little kind of excitement and curiosity that I feel like is essential if you're going to take on a project like that, you know, of a book length project.
And I thought I'd ask you all, actually. I ask this every year, so I can't remember how many years I've been doing the Royal Society Book Prize interview, but I always ask about the challenges, and perhaps I'll ask it to all of you, and you could all answer, not at the same time. But what are the challenges in writing for a general audience? Because obviously your books have been chosen in large part because they are very clear expositions of difficult and challenging subjects. So when you're writing, perhaps I'll start with Bill, because you haven't said anything for a while, and go around, but what are the main challenges of writing a general science book for a general audience?
My answer is for me, it's fairly easy, because I'm not an expert. And really all I'm doing, Brian, is I take a topic that I'm pretty sure will keep me engaged and happily occupied for, you know, at least 3 or 4 years, because that's how long it takes to write a book. as Susanna was saying. So it has to be something that I'm pretty sure that I will be able to plug into and stay engaged by for a sustained period. It couldn't be anything worse than being 18 months into a book and thinking this is boring as hell. So so you need that, and then it's really just a question of me trying to learn as much as I can and understand these complicated things at whatever level I can, and then trying to convey it to other people who are in the same position as me. So in a sense, unlike most of you other panelists, I'm not a scientist, and I'm not writing for scientists, so this is very much a pursuit of outsiders. But I think that science is something that is really interesting to non-scientists as well, or at least ought to be. And so that's the area that I've always been trying to tap into, is for the non-specialists.
And just Bill, why did you choose to write about science in the first place? Because obviously you're an extremely well-known author without having to delve into the complexities of the world.
Well, I'm slightly embarrassed to say that a big part of the reason was because I was so bored by science in school when I was growing up in America. I was just completely put off by every single science class I was ever exposed to, and yet I knew that science is fascinating. I mean, I avidly watched programs like Horizon and QED and things like that, and I read science articles in the paper. I mean, like any human being, I'm interested in knowing who we are and where we come from and how we got here, and all of those things, all those questions that science can answer. So I was convinced that there had to be some level at which I could engage with science without being a scientist, without having to understand all the theorems and be able to write things on a blackboard, because that's just not me. I mean, I would never be able to do the kind of stuff that you do. But at the same time, there isn't any reason why I should be shut out of science altogether and not be able to appreciate the wonders of the world and the universe around us.
Susanna, I mean, it's the same question to you, but also I suppose just an additional question. I shouldn't ask two questions at once, should I? But it strikes me that I wanted to ask you why you wrote the book. I think most authors, I think both Camilla and Susanna, to me, in all the years I've been doing this prize, I think your two books are the most personal. So I can see it's quite obvious why you decided to write about the book. But so I want to ask you about the difficulty of writing, the attempt to clarify your subject, I suppose, but also that more general question of the value of science writing beyond the personal. So maybe Susanna, I'll start with you.
So, in terms of the challenges of writing science themed books for a popular audience, for me, it was, I came in as a complete lay person like Bill. I really asked a lot of stupid questions, which I think is a kind of superpower of sorts, because you realize that most people who are honest and experts in their field also don't have answers for the simplest questions. And what emerges over time is that the more you learn about a given subject, the less certain you are about things in general. So that became very hard, because the more I learned about psychiatry, about the brain, about behavior, the more the kind of ground fell beneath me, and I felt that it was really hard to say things without also adding but, however, so it was very hard to be certain about many things, and I realized that is the case whenever you take on a subject and learn more and more about it. And kind of the best people in their respective fields and the greatest thinkers, I think, reflect that fact too. I mean, I kept hearing again and again, I don't know, we don't know, that's a mystery. And it's hard to, there were piles of mysteries layered on top of each other. And it was hard to ask the reader to be comfortable with that much uncertainty. But I unfortunately, I had to, because there was very little that I could really say with any certainty that I felt comfortable affirming. And that can be a hard place to be in when you're writing for a popular audience.
And Camilla, the same question to you, the challenges, I suppose, of writing a science book, a popular science book.
Well, after hearing all of that, it's quite interesting, because I think when you write a book, you do lots of reading, and you're like, okay, you take kind of this input information for granted. Your worry is mainly about, like, you know, memorizing it and putting it together. With me, it's at the very start. So my challenge, I've always been a layperson to how information is delivered at schools, nuances, small talk, observations. And I think when it comes to how my challenge is personally is interpreting information and making it make sense to me. And ironically, in the process in which I've done that, I've actually formed the book itself. But having said that, because I understand things from the ground up, I can't, I find it really hard to understand things that are vague, which are abstract in the writing. And I think because of that, I've written with a lot of translatable detail I hope people can map themselves onto. So for me, the hard bit was translating what I saw, what I thought, into something that was coherent enough for people to read. So, but I wrote it, the broad science book, because at the end of the day, when it comes to looking at all these specific research principles, you could go on forever of the detail and get lost in it. And I mean, that's just standard, really. But when it comes to when you boil it down to the details, you've got thermodynamics, you've got all these different common denominators that they all kind of fit within. And that's one of the things that I wrote about, because I might not have an equation in my book, but the principle is there, the seed of thought is there. And I'm hoping that for each kind of angle of science, they can be mapped onto one of the chapters, just to get someone started.
On one of the descriptions of your book, I think you say yourself that it's this question that I think we all ask, which is, what does it mean to be human? It's one of the central questions, if not the central existential question. What does it mean to be human? I don't want to put you on the spot, and people should read your book to see your answer. But if I ask you that question and you have a very short time to answer it, what's your answer?
Just to give it a go.
Give it a go.
Just to give it a go. I think it's to, at the end of the day, we're all doing our best. Do what you, I wouldn't say love, but do what you're obsessed with, and don't be afraid of being obsessed, because obsession is basically evolution on fire. It gets us through, and it keeps us alive. So I think, and at the end of the day, worrying about the outcome is something that is very human, but the process is basically what we live for. So I think it's giving it a good go, and that's all you can ask for, really, from yourself and from other people. So I think I mentioned in my last chapter about I got a watermelon from my friend because I thought she'd like watermelon, and I like lugged it on the tube, and I mean it wasn't a cold day, it was a hot day. But then again, she was like, I hate watermelon, I'm really sorry. But I thought, it's okay. I've done my best, and now I've got muscles, so brilliant.
I hesitate to throw what does it mean to be human to the panel, but maybe I should, because maybe I shouldn't. I don't know if either of you want to answer that question. Maybe I see Bill smiling there. I see Susanna saying, "Don't ask, please." Don't. Maybe Bill.
Well, from the perspective of my own book, it is to be a sort of walking miracle. That is the thing that I came away with the book, with doing the research for the book, was the fact that, as I said earlier in our talk, there are 37 trillion cells within you. That's how much it takes to make each one of us, and those cells work together in concert in this amazingly, incredibly well choreographed manner. They don't have to do that, and yet somehow, for some reason, they elect to be you, to stick there together, and kill themselves off when necessary for the greater good of you. And so the thing that I came away with from the book, and what it is to be human to me, is to have this supreme gift given to you, which we all get once, and then life is bounded by two very long eternities. And we have this moment of existence, which I think is the greatest luck and the greatest fortune and the greatest joy. And yet, every one of us spends a great deal of our time failing to appreciate that. And so the one thing I came away with from the book is that, there shouldn't be a day goes by, at least, that you don't just, give thanks for your own existence.
Well, I think we're almost out of time, actually. So I wanted to give Susanna a word. We had two beautiful summaries of the books and the wider human condition. So maybe I could throw to you to talk about either that, if you have reflections on that, or if not, what I suppose what you'd like people to take away at the end of your book. But feel free to give a wider answer if you'd wish.
I think Bill called it the greatest luck, and I agree. And I think it's also the greatest mystery, right? This idea of what makes a human. What is the soul? What is the mind? What is the brain? These are questions that have animated humanity since the beginning of time, or mankind, or humankind. And I think in a lot of ways, I hope that with my book, and I think all the books on this panel and the greater panel, is this idea of not being afraid of that complexity and embracing uncertainty and the unknown as not being a negative thing, but as being an opportunity, an exciting thing. Kind of the essence of being alive is mysterious and horrifying in some ways and beautiful. And I think those questions and that inherent mystery is key. So I think it kind of is a through line throughout basically all of literature, but definitely the greater panel too.
Well, thank you all. I'm really sorry we've run out of time. It's tremendously uplifting. Certainly the last 10 minutes there, the beautiful summaries of this great mystery. What do you say, Susanna? The horrific mystery, is how you describe it?
I don't remember.
So thank you very much. Just to say to everyone that's listening and watching, I'm sure that you can go to Waterstones and buy these books, £2.50 discount. What more do you want? So go and buy them. But thank you, Bill, Susanna and Camilla. We're going to take a short break now, just a couple of minutes, and then we'll be back with Professor Jim Al-Khalili, Professor Linda Scott, and Gaia Vince.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good.
Was that okay?
Yes. Who were these?
Well, welcome back, everybody, after that short break. I should say, I don't know whether I should explain why I have a virtual background. It's because I'm in a very small room, and I'm lecturing actually at the University of Manchester to my undergraduates, and they all criticised me for sitting in a cupboard lecturing to them, and it is effectively a cupboard. So whilst all the other authors seem to have these magnificent rooms with beautiful bookcases behind them, I am almost literally in a cupboard, so I decided to choose the TARDIS. So that's my way of explanation. That's why I'm sat here. So let's invite the next three authors, the other three authors out of the 6 that are nominated with the Royal Society Insight Investment Book Prize, Professor Jim Al-Khalili, Professor Linda Scott, and Gaia Vince. So hello and welcome. I don't know if you were listening to that, but you all have to explain what it means to be human in a tremendously eloquent way at the end of this discussion. I think we should do that. I think that should be now a tradition for the Royal Society Insight Investment Book Prize from now on. But for now, so we'll go around in the same format, I suppose. So in alphabetical order, I'll ask each of you to give us a minute or so on your book, and then we'll go into the questions. So let's start with Jim.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Well, my book is called The World According to Physics. A colleague of mine at university said, if you put your thumb on the cover and cover up the word physics, it reads The World According to Jim Al-Khalili, which makes it sound like it's, a sort of a polemic, I go to town. And in a way, it sort of is. I mean, it's a popular science book about our current understanding of the laws of physics and the nature of the universe and so on. But it really is sort of quite compact and pocket-sized. I often think that there are lots of brilliant authors. I mean, you and I are among them, Brian, of course, who've written popular. There's lots of big tomes, popular science books on physics that cover sort of everything of our understanding of the universe, all the way back from the ancient Greeks. So I think, so if you think of our knowledge of the physical universe like an island, these books are an exploration of the island. My book is more of a sort of an exploration of the shoreline. So, the current limits of what we know, beyond which is sort of the ocean of the unknown. So I say, where are we now, beginning of the 21st century? What do we understand? What is our current best theories about the nature of reality? And what is there that we have yet to understand? So in a way, it's trying to sort of, update people on, what latest ideas are in physics, but it is also, I have to say, my love affair with the subject that I have spent all my life, thinking about, being passionate about. And so, I sometimes think, why isn't everyone in love with physics? And apparently there are some people out there who don't love physics. I mean, just go figure. So I'm trying to infect people with my enthusiasm for this subject that deals with some of the biggest questions that face humans.
Thanks, Jim. Linda.
My book is called The Double X Economy, The Epic Potential of Empowering Women. And it is about describing the 360-degree exclusion of women from the world economy. Not just unequal, but excluded. And that this has been the condition worldwide and throughout human history. But we've been basically ignoring it, mostly because we don't think women are important, but also because our economics is construed in such a way where we would be blind to it. And it has a very, very negative impact on the whole species. And so it has a massive economic negative effect, but also it has humanitarian damage. It causes a lot of tragedy and suffering. And what that means then is that if we close these gender gaps, and there are many of them, not just the one on pay, we would just reap extraordinary benefits worldwide. That this is something that offers an enormous amount of hope, and we know a lot about what practically can be done.
Thanks, Linda. Gaia.
Hi. So Transcendence is really an investigation into the extraordinary nature of us, the human ape. How come we are not living in a forest, climbing trees, but we have become this dominant species over the planet? So it's really an exploration of our evolution, and it's I call it the human evolutionary triad. It's the co-evolution of our genes, our environment, and importantly our culture, which made us so extraordinary and so unlike all the other animals. And I talk about these 4 key agents of our transformation, which are fire, language, beauty, and time. And I look at how we made ourselves and a peek ahead at where we might be headed. And so perhaps a key idea of the book is that we are each a product of our own cultural developing bath, which makes us. And one more key idea really is that it's not our individual smarts, our individual intelligence that has made us so extraordinary, but the collaborations we form. It's our collective culture and our collective brain.
Thank you. So thank you all. I thought maybe I'll start with Linda. You partially defined it, but this term, it's a very powerful title, double X economy. Could you tell us, you partly answered it, but in detail what you mean by that particular phrase?
Right. This is a phrase that I used to describe the world economy of women. And we now know from fairly recent economic data that, that there's a gender gap in economics in every country in the world. Nobody has solved it. No country, even though they think they have, has solved it. And it affects everything from internal family financial management to participation in world trade. And everywhere, it's marked by the inequality is held together and held in place by very specific constraints and mechanisms that don't really vary from place to place. And even in the West, where we think we've solved all these problems and made them equal, you can see the vestiges of the past in the present. So for instance, if you look at land holding by country globally, what you see is that the men on average own 80%, and in total they own more than 80% of the world's arable surface. Well, this is not a random pattern. This has to do with the constraints, but it also means, well, women throughout history have not been allowed to own property, for instance, okay, by law usually. And it's something that once, you know, a group controls capital, they don't let go of it very quickly. And so it has held on for a long time, so that, for example, in the UK, women are only 13.7% of landholders, and that's just kind of shocking, right? So this is so anyway, the thing is that the double X economy was meant to describe this very particular pattern and its consistency. And some people want to know why I referred to a biological phenomenon, the double X chromosome, and because in feminism it's not cool to do that. But the reason is because this is a system that gets levied on women from the moment their parents see female genitals at birth. This is not something that's about identity. It's not something that's about choice. This is something you get born into. And most places you don't ever get out of it.
And it strikes me from what you've said that there's clearly a clear moral argument here, but also you come at it as a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at Oxford. So is your argument it's in part that in terms of productivity, in terms of growing the economy by any measure, what you have here is an untapped resource, which is essentially... Oh,
absolutely. Yeah, it's just a wanton waste of resources. I think to me, the most clear illustration is that for example, in Britain and in most of the developed countries right now, women outnumber men in higher education by about 30 to 50%. And yet they don't get the kind of support that allows them to stay in the workplace and basically pay off the investment that the society has made in their education. And it's just shameful. It's like building a freeway system and not letting anybody use it. So it's, yeah, a lot of waste. There's a lot of kind of unrecognized damage, for example, with equal pay. equal pay has macro impact on GDP because of various frustrations of productivity, but also we tend to think of it as all about, do women deserve this money? And we don't think about the fact that that it has an impact on family well-being, because there are fewer resources, for example, for children. So for instance, the gender pay gap in Britain costs British households on average £9,000 a year. And when you realize that the average household income is like 30,000, right? That's a lot of money to be denying British households. Right? That's an impact on human well-being. So yes, I make those kinds of arguments, but it is a lot about social justice, and it is a lot about humanitarianism. So I look a lot at the considerable costs, for example, of domestic violence, human trafficking, world hunger, all of those things you can put a price tag on. If I may just extend the example, domestic violence costs on average countries 5% of GDP. That's the same as what they spend on primary education, and it's 30 times what the world spends on international aid. It's really, really expensive. So
it's fairly clear argument that you Gaia, in a way, I suppose, I mean, it may be unfair to relate your book to what Linda's just said, but yours is a broader historical view, a very broad historical view of the systems, the structures that made us who we are, which is essentially celebratory, a point, because we are something to be celebrated despite our problems. So I wondered if you could comment on that. That was my specific question about your book, but it may be because of what Linda said, if there are any things that you saw that fit into that structure.
What about the systems that we created? Yes, so that's my big fascination, systems, and I've been fascinated with human systems and planetary systems and how they're very interconnected. And I mean, it's enraging. What Linda was saying is completely enraging, isn't it? Especially as a woman, but just as a human, it's completely maddening. So I mean, this book is really about complexity, and my book is about complexity and about how we create our own human systems and how individuals and societies fit in, and how we build those. There's this constant paradox, this constant tension between tribalism and between collaboration, and it was actually really hard because I wrote this very complicated book during a time where I was writing about how our deep history and our more recent history, but especially our deep evolutionary history, is really built on, it's predicated on collaboration. We are only as successful a species as we are because we collaborate. We rely on each other for everything, literally. We can't even give birth alone. A woman can't give birth alone. I mean, if you consider how essential that is, obviously, for the transmission of the genes for the next generation. So for our biological evolution to have gone down that path, obviously, we had to have culturally been able to rely on each other, to collaborate. And so that's what we've done throughout our history. And cultural evolution, it accelerates when you have the biggest group, the biggest society, and the most connectivity, how interconnected and networked that society is, because you have to share that diversity. You have to, first of all, your group has to hold all these different cultural solutions to problems, and then you have to be able to share those so that they can come together and create new solutions. And I was writing this book during this, while we're living at this time of increasing populism. And if you think that populism at its heart is a denial of complexity, that's what it is. It's a denial of complexity. And that's very seductive, because we all want a simplified version. We want this simplified idea. but really, so that was very difficult because I was writing about the opposite, and really, if there's anything I want the reader to take away, or just generally to say, it's to engage with complexity, because we do live at this time where we do have these huge problems. And so not only is there real beauty and excitement to be found in understanding the complexity of how things work at this very complicated time, when you need to understand a little bit of science, a little bit of numeracy, and you have to understand how all these things fit together. If you understand the system, the human system, and how that human system impacts and affects now at this stage in the 21st century, a global planetary system. And if you're able to make those nuanced decisions, as we all have a responsibility to do, you do have to engage with that complexity, and you have to reject those simple populist answers, not just for now, but for the generations to come. Sorry, I didn't mean to make this very political, but I was writing it during the time of populism, of Brexit, of the complete reversal of the whole thesis of my argument. So
well, I was going to ask you actually, because I mean, you won. I should say you won the prize in 2015 for Adventures in the Anthropocene. And then, so you would have had to make a decision then to write your next book. The way you presented it seems like it was a coincidence that you were writing this book about the global complexity of human civilization at a time when there are certain people who would like to make everything very simple. Was it in part a response to events, or was it, as you say,
it was not a coincidence. This has been burning away for some time. It's an urgency. I feel very fired up by this what's really happened, which feels like a sort of unraveling, because these are systems, because of the synergy that comes together from various issues that we face, whether it's social injustice and poverty, whether it's climate breakdown, whether it's biodiversity loss. All these different elements come together, urbanization, migration, all these different issues. And really winning that prize was a great honor and a validation, and it gave me the confidence to tackle what I think is the biggest question, which is how did we become this creature capable of changing the planet, and how can we understand that human system which is driving now the planetary system, this physical system, and through that to better understand the next steps and how we might solve these huge crises that we're facing globally. And yeah, to be shortlisted now is just the biggest honor, and it's so exciting, because this is such a big subject, and I know it has been tackled obviously before by, you know, what does it mean to be human, and what is the history of humans by big ideas people who are almost entirely men. So I did give it I was interested in giving it a female slant, and to looking at it in a different way, from an environmental perspective as well, and a scientific perspective, not a human, not the classic historical and psychology perspective, but weaving those in, because of course it covers everything, and it is this huge big complex book. But and I don't think I would have had the confidence to feel that I was allowed to tackle this subject if I hadn't won that prize. So yeah, thank you so much, Royal Society.
It's a very interesting point you make before I go to Jim, because people often ask the question that what's the point of these prizes, and the fact that you say that they can give an author confidence and inspire an author to tackle even bigger questions is I think a very good answer to the question, what is the point of prizes?
Totally, it does give that, and it also gives the publisher confidence to commission that book from you. So so it's I really think prizes are, you know, there are bad points perhaps to prizes as well, but I really think they can do an awful lot to help writers.
to help spread ideas. So Jim, your book, you describe it as an ode to physics. There is also, actually, we've I think spoken about two, what you might call partly at least polemical books, Linda's and Gaia's. Yours is partly polemical, of course, at the end, I notice. So what was the question is about the inspiration to write a book, as you said, quite a small, not a detailed book, but almost a love letter to physics, an overview of the subject. But was there also a desire, a polemical desire underlying the project?
I think there was, yes. I mean, I'd written other books about some of these big ideas in physics, quantum mechanics, the nature of space and time, and so on. And so just in terms of explaining the physical universe, I sort of got a lot of that stuff off my chest. So this isn't simply I didn't want to just to rehash the same old, the Big Bang and what's inside a black hole and what does an atom look like, sort of descriptions. I did have things that I felt passionate about. The trick was to try and sneak them in and make it not sound as though, I was going off on trying to preach, physics to anyone who would listen. You're right. At the end of the book, it does get a bit more polemical, but there I think I almost sort of drifted into trying to explain how we know what we know. How are we so confident about something? The Big Bang happened 13.8 billion years ago. Well, how do you know? You weren't there. And you can explain, well, there's this evidence and there's the cosmic microwave background and we see that the universe is expanding. But that may not be very convincing to someone who doesn't have a background, sort of who studied physics for years and appreciates the nuances of the argument. So I did want to get across what the scientific method is about and how do we, we're never 100% confident. We always have doubts. We're always prepared to change our minds. It's the sort of thing that now I think wider society is coming to appreciate more with the pandemic, because you're hearing scientists saying, we think this is how the virus is behaving, and this is whether you might or might not get immunity, and we're working on a vaccine. And that uncertainty, which underpins science, which is completely the opposite of the way, say, politics works, it's important to get that across. When was the last time a politician admitted that they were wrong? And yet I celebrate that in the book. And, I give the example of when I was making this BBC documentary on gravity, and we'd finished filming it, and it was about to sort of be aired on BBC4 a few weeks later. And then we found I'd made a mistake. I'd basically got something completely wrong about the nature of time slowing down in Earth's gravity, Einstein's theory of relativity. And I was told initially, well, look, we'll just reshoot the bits that, you got wrong and no one will be any the wiser. But I insisted that this is a wonderful opportunity to show that in science, we get things wrong and it's okay, because that's how you learn. If you never make mistakes, you never move to a better theory. And I said, oh no, Jim, we're worried about your reputation. If you admit that you've made a mistake, people won't trust you. Well, that's part of the trust in science, is because of our, ability or willingness to say that we've made mistakes. So in that last part of the book, I do talk more generally about the scientific method and how we know that there's dark matter out in the universe. How do we know that the universe expansion is getting faster? How do we know that atoms can be in two places at once? These aren't just wacky, although they do sound wacky, ideas that some boffin comes up with in the middle of the night. These are ideas and theories that we have reluctantly come to accept are the way our universe is because of the way science works.
It seems to me all three of you, Jim, Gaia and Linda, have written books that are in some ways trying to change behavior, or at least trying to create a debate in society that leads to a change. They're all polemical books in their way, as I've said. So, Linda, I wanted to ask you how big an impact you think that popular science books can have on, I suppose, in catalyzing genuine change.
Well, I can only speak to what I hope in my own instance. I mean, I think popular science books are great because I love to read them and learn. I'm not sure, necessarily how some of them do change, because sometimes it's just for your own edification, and that's plenty good enough. In my case, if I can just tell a little bit, The Devil's Economy is as much about my journey of discovery as it is about the argument. And it started because I was doing research all over the world among the poorest women in the most remote communities in the most distressed nations. And it was weird to me that when I went to all these different places, from Africa to Asia or whatever, I was seeing the same thing everywhere, exactly the same thing everywhere. And of course, the macro data was coming out that also showed that. And I thought, okay, this is too weird because we've been taught that this is a cultural thing. All right, but if it's a cultural thing, it should vary, and it doesn't. And so I felt like I needed to come up with the answer. Only two things could be true, it seemed to me at the time. It was either had some natural basis, or it was really, really old. So what I had to do was to try to figure that out by both going as deeply as I could and widely into the science that might explain it, and also to try to trace the history to figure out if you could start long ago and get to where we are. Well, along the way, I finally decided it's an entanglement between our history and our nature, right? And it's the fact that our nature has a history and is not fixed. But in my case, I felt I had to, and this is really where the science came in the book, is that I had to answer any and all of the bogus objections that have been thrown up against gender equality, like male dominance is natural, mothers naturally withdraw, from life to take care of their children, that kind of stuff. And in all but one case, all but one topic, I found that what is the kind of stuff that's bandied about is utterly bogus because it's so out of touch with more recent science, okay? And I think those things could potentially make sociological change because they're being used to quash gender equality. So that's where I was. I think if I can just add one more thing, that I think the thing that I'm finding just jars people the most about the science part is that most people I find still don't know about bonobos. All right, so we are equally related to chimps and bonobos, but people thought bonobos were chimps for a long time. But they share 99% of our DNA, and with each other they share 99.6. So you would expect them to be virtually identical because they're virtually identical genetically, but instead socially they are the opposite. Chimps are male dominant and bonobos are female dominant. So it's equally likely, since we don't know where any of us came from in terms of an animal ancestor, shared animal ancestors, equally likely that we were one or the other. And then of course that gets into the whole question of, then how did we evolve one way or another? And one of the most uplifting things I think I found was how malleable humans really are. This stuff is not baked in. It's been baked in, but it doesn't have to be baked in.
Gaia, perhaps you'd like to pick up on that. That crosses over very neatly into your picture, the picture you deliver in the book of this tremendously complex system that's evolved, not only the system, the natural world, but also our human systems that have evolved in concert for many, many thousands of years. So perhaps you'd like to pick up on that.
Well, so I also looked at the origins of the patriarchy and how it differs in different societies, and links between agriculture, so agriculture that evolved more collectively, is they even now have slightly more egalitarian societies than those that started with plough-based agriculture, and those that use digging sticks, where women can take part as well, are less patriarchal generally, and also the this idea when you were talking, Linda, about the genetic difference between humans and chimps and bonobos, and between bonobos and chimps, and so on. I think right now, among the politicians who are trying to drive a wedge between our sort of tribal and collective natures, there's this idea that racism is something that's biological, that there are different races, and that's genetically a huge mess. It doesn't work. You can't distinguish people genetically as different from different races. We're all pretty much the same. But chimpanzees, there is more genetic difference between chimpanzees either side of the Congo River than there are between people on different continents. And I thought it was kind of interesting because I was looking at how we change, and so we have these huge feedback mechanisms in this human system between our environmental drivers, our biological drivers, and our cultural drivers, and they really make, they make us. So everything. So even though we are biologically very similar, culturally we're very, very diverse, and that has driven some selective differences between different groups. For example, if you look at the languages we've evolved, culturally evolved, if you live in if your language evolved in a sort of a wet, woody area, they have fewer consonants because they don't travel as well through that environment than languages like English, which bursts with consonants, has so many consonants, because that's evolved. That cultural evolution has taken place in a different environment. And then you can look at how different environments have driven different biological things. The famous one, of course, is things like altitude tolerance. So people in Tibet are able to tolerate higher altitudes much better, and they give birth and have fetuses that survive that low oxygen level better than people whose ancestors evolved at low levels. But there was a time, of course, deep in our history where truly different races of people did exist. Where there were Neanderthals, where there were Denisovans, where there were different races of, I call them races. They're technically species, different species, but I think of them as races because we did interbreed with them. We shared technologies with them, and they were very similar to us. So when we have this huge sort of superiority, because technologically we're extremely we have these extremely complex societies and complex technologies, it's very easy to look back at our predecessors from either different races or just earlier on, Stone Age people, and think, oh, they were very primitive. Yeah. What does it mean?
Yeah.
Something I wanted to explore.
Can I?
Yes.
Sure, Linda.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I actually, at least with the degree, where I came out was that it was important to recognize that actually we have a very dark past, and that actually male dominance, and I would say more what they're now calling toxic masculinity, which we really don't see that much of in our cultures. Men have been very much redefining masculinity. It's very different now than, for example, when I was young. But I do think it's important to recognize it as primitive because it has a deeply primitive effect. And it is the one thing, or at least one of the things, that when you go from culture to culture around the world or over time, does hold steady. But I do think what you do see is this amazing escalation that happens because of as the systems grew more complex and had certain reward systems, certain practices, that dominance escalated in a very negative way. So if I can give an example, so for example, we often expect in evolution that what what happens is that whatever the good characteristics are, right, get perpetuated because the females like that characteristic, right? But in humans, human females throughout most of time and in most of the world today do not get to choose their mates. And for a long, long time, humans had a rape culture that would stagger us even now. And because it was so tied up in the way humans, the whole cycle of male dominance and the violence, what ended up happening is that the more violent males got more access to females because they were given wives and this kind of stuff. And that behavior, as well as the genetics and probably the hormones along with it, I think has made us spiral into more and more violence. Now, I will say there's an argument about this in evolutionary theory and neuroscience, okay, between Robert Sapolsky and Richard Wrangham, all right? But I because I'm doing interdisciplinary work, I had to reconcile often for my own writing which was more plausible in one science or another. And I think the history shows very clearly that Sapolsky is right. So we become more, not less, violent, except for about the last, well, they call it the long peace since World War II.
Jim, we're talking about society. We've been talking about society for the last 20 minutes, humans on Earth in particular. But one of my great heroes, I know one of your great heroes, Carl Sagan, and also I think you do this very well, is you speak of how studying the natural world in particular, I think, but not limited to astronomy and cosmology, give us a valuable perspective on what it means to be human, on the value of our civilization. So could you comment on that wider, or how studying physics, as you talked about earlier, can link into these very human challenges that we face?
Yeah, I feel I didn't get the memo when the shortlisted books were all about humans and human behavior, and here I am talking about, good old physics.
but as I said, though, you do link it.
I do, yeah. I mean, for me, when you look out into the universe and try and understand how and why the world is the way it is, that's what defines our humanity. That's one of the ways we can say how our brains developed so much beyond that of our relatives and beyond our ancestors, that we can contemplate our own existence, we can contemplate our place in the universe. If there are alien intelligences out there somewhere else in the universe or in our galaxy, and they're contemplating the nature of reality, the wonderful thing for me is that they would come up with the same explanations. They would come up with the same mathematical equations. The same laws of physics exist everywhere. That universality of understanding the universe, that is something we all have in common. I've also written about, not in this book, but I've written about the history and development of ideas in science. And one of the wonderful things is that throughout history, civilizations rise and fall. You had the ancient Greeks, then you had, India and China and Persia and the Islamic Empire. Science is science. It's a baton that's passed on from one civilization to the next. And subjects like physics or chemistry or biology, the natural sciences, where that aren't, they're easier to cope with than the complexities of human nature and human behavior. So I always find I'm lucky, that quantum mechanics is simple compared with trying to understand, psychology or sociology or neuroscience. It's just a few equations and they describe everything. But it's that universality of the laws that govern the entire universe that we're discovering that I think binds us throughout history and across cultures and across other species. If there's other intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, they would discover those same laws.
Is there, Jim? Is there?
Oh, if there is, well, who knows?
And in your book, we're coming towards the end, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I just want to ask you specifically about your book. Remember, we've seen a bit of a two cultures divide, perhaps even, which I strongly believe doesn't exist. Do you remember C.P. Snow said if there's one thing that he thought would be the measure that everybody should know, it's the second law of thermodynamics. But I remember, I think it was Peter Atkins who wrote, he doubts that C.P. Snow understood it himself when he said that. In any case, from your book, if there's one thing that you think is the most important thing that you write about in this survey of physics, what would it be?
I would say it is that despite how far we've come in understanding what everything's made of, the basic building blocks of reality, the nature of space and time and matter and energy in the universe, we still haven't got to the end. The wonderful thing about science in general is that there are still mysteries out there. You know, we try and solve mysteries, we try and understand as much as we can, but the joy is in the curiosity, is in trying to solve those mysteries. And what I try and get across there, even a subject like physics is a very mature subject, and with all the successes and all the technologies, the fact that we're talking today over Zoom using computers that depend on microchips that we wouldn't have if we didn't understand quantum physics. Despite all the advances, there are still things we don't understand, and we should never feel arrogant enough to think that we're reaching the end. You know, that ocean of the unknown may go on forever. We'd like to think that we're going to get to a grand theory of everything, but maybe it'll just be another layer of the onion that we peel back to reveal a deeper mystery. That's part of the wonder of why I enjoy the subject.
And what's the most stunning thing? If you look through all the stunning facts in your book, a size and scale of the universe, the existence of dark matter and so on, what's the thing that you think would be the most surprising if you said, so you know what we've discovered in the last few decades?
I suppose the most surprising, the most unexpected discovery in physics, it isn't something like, you know, the Higgs boson, because we were sort of expecting to find that. It's not gravitational waves, because Einstein predicted that 100 years ago. No, it's the fact that we knew the universe is expanding, it's getting bigger. We've known that for almost a century. It was the discovery right at the end of the last century that the expansion of the universe isn't slowing down. Everybody thought that gravity of all the stuff in the universe is putting the brakes on and stopping the expansion that's been happening since the Big Bang. No, the expansion is getting faster and faster and faster, and we're just the universe is blowing apart. That is unexpected. It's incredible, and it just beggars belief. It does my head in, even though I understand how we are convinced that that is right. It's just an incredible discovery.
Yeah, and Brian Schmidt, who made that discovery, got the Nobel Prize. He's a very fine winemaker. I don't know what that's
well, fantastic. Well, then he's well deserving of the Nobel.
In Canberra. Gaia and Linda, I wanted to draw this discussion to a close. Maybe starting with Gaia. We outlined just the way this discussion went. We outlined some of the real problems we have as a species, the political, the way we organize our societies. But there is, well, it's a question, but I'd like, there is room for optimism, ? Is the question. So to Gaia first, are you optimistic despite the challenges we face?
Yeah, I am. Of course I am. You know, otherwise what's the point? I am optimistic. So in my book, I describe these 4 agents that drive us, and the 4th one is time, which is this different way of knowing, this different way of understanding, which is basically science. It's this looking at the objective truths about our world and trying to measure it and understanding more by disproving what happened before, you know, which is the scientific process, which I think started in, you know, in a prehistory with observations of the, you know, you see the Lascaux paintings as observations of our heavens and so on, and has now brought us to the knowledge that the universe is expanding. So, so in terms of solving these huge crises that we face, and we absolutely do face enormous crises, technologically and scientifically, you know, we have the solution. That's not the problem. We are also a very big and interconnected, almost superorganism of a species now. So, you know, when you become a superorganism, you can affect change in a very different way. You know, it becomes a network, and so a little tweak here can have big ramifications elsewhere. And the problem is that some of us are on the outside of this network, of this superorganism, and very exposed, and suffer the consequences of all of these, whereas others are protected at the middle. And we need to work out how to solve these problems as a human system. I think we will. I'll say that because there's no more time, and I want to be hopeful because I am hopeful.
And I suppose it's been vividly demonstrated during the pandemic, the idea that we're extremely
the pandemic could not have been a more beautiful example of everything that I've been talking about. How a virus which whose natural host is a wild animal enters the human system in a city in China, and then, because of the globalized nature of us all, spreads really widely and could sicken us all. But then at the same time, we've seen this extraordinary collaboration of scientists around the world who have put aside their tribal and deeply competitive interests in the attempt to solve this very, very urgent human problem. They've put the humanity ahead of all other, you know, even in the heart of this, you know, what we've seen in the most nationalistic, sort of regressive kind of states, we've still seen the scientists collaborating together to bring solutions to this problem. And we've seen people voluntarily changing their behavior from one day to the next, not because there are military with guns outside their door going, you will stay apart, you will stay home. They've taken this huge behavioral change on themselves. And that really it underlines exactly what an incredible, extraordinary species we are, and why we should be hopeful, I think, for a good outcome in our other crises.
And finally, to Linda, so optimism ? I mean, I should say that I noticed on Melinda Gates said of your book that you create a compelling and actionable case for unleashing women's economic power. So given that there is a compelling and actionable case, are you optimistic that this will happen, as you argue, for the amongst other things, for the good of the global economy?
There has been a community of people, sort of a coalition of international organizations that has been working on women's economic empowerment for about the last 15 years. And at this point, we have a pretty solid idea of what the damage is, but also what to do about it and what the impact would be. So, and it is amazing that how some of this, you would think the simplest things have a huge impact. So for example, property ownership. If we equalize property ownership, particularly in the developing world, it would give women more access to, for example, agricultural inputs and stuff. But the UN estimates we would then feed 150 million of the world's chronically hungry just from doing that. It's a big deal. In addition, equalized rights to property ownership also has been shown to significantly reduce domestic violence and increase the probability that children will be educated. Okay, so yeah, my book is all about, in the end, what do we do? And that because we know we can really accomplish a lot, it's not I don't think it's just like an angry book. It's a hopeful book. It's intended to recruit people to the cause, and you don't do that just by complaining.
Well, yeah, and as I think I've heard from all of you, the optimistic point, the point you've all made is we know how to do this, right? Which is surely cause for optimism. So Linda, Guy and Jim, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm sorry we ran over by 6 minutes because it was so interesting. So thank you all. So just to close this evening, I should close very quickly, but I should say that the winner will be announced on Tuesday, November the 3rd on a live stream at the Royal Society. So, and it will be on the Royal Society's YouTube page. So I'd encourage you all to go to the Royal Society's website now. You'll see how to connect with that, that stream and the timings and so forth. So thank you to all the authors, all wonderful books. Thank you to Waterstones. Thank you particularly, I want to say again, to Insight Investment. I think we've heard that getting these ideas across in an intelligible way is tremendously important. We need as many people as possible to think about these ideas. This is one of the key ways that you do it. We couldn't do this without Insight Investment support. So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. See you all on Tuesday, November the 3rd for the.
Thank you, Brian, for building a TARDIS for the evening as well.
There shouldn't be. There shouldn't. Shall I show you? Shall I show you all why I've done that? There you go. So just before we go, if I turn that off, I'm in a cupboard. Yeah. So there you go. So
you shattered the illusion of millions.
I know. Maybe I should do that and just sit there. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thanks,
See you all on November the 3rd. Thank you.